Welcome to Diversity in Glass Practices. The Manitoba Craft Council is located in Winnipeg within Treaty 1 land, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, Dakota, and is the birthplace of the Métis Nation. My name is Katrina Craig, and on behalf of the Manitoba Craft Council, I would like to welcome you to Diversity in Glass Practices. The Manitoba Craft Council was founded in 1978 as Manitoba's only not-for-profit arts organization dedicated exclusively to contemporary craft. In these challenging times, the Manitoba Craft Council is proud to create programming to help artists, craftspeople, and makers adapt to the rapid and continuing changes in our community. In celebration of Carissa Baktay's show, Former, join us for Diversity in Glass Practices. Helen Delacretaz will moderate a conversation about contemporary approaches to working with glass. Helen is joined by contemporary glass artists Carissa Baktay, Warren Carther, and Ione Thorkelsson. Baktay, Carther, and Thorkelsson will present their creative practices led by Delacretaz, providing insight to their creative directions, technical considerations, and concepts that contribute to the diversity of contemporary glass in the Canadian Prairies. Curator of Form, Jenny Western, will join the panel for the Q&A session to follow. Please type any questions you have into the chat and they will be answered at the Q&A after the presentation. And please note, you have to be logged into your YouTube account to comment. So I'm going to introduce our moderator. Since 2014, Helen Delacretaz has held the position of Director, Exhibitions at Canada's newest national museum, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, located here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Formerly, she was the Chief Curator and Curator Decorative Arts, Fine Arts at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, where she has the joy of working with the Canadian craft community for 16 years. It is with pleasure that she returns to explain craft for the Manitoba Craft Council through moderating this panel discussion.
Thank you, Katrina, and the Manitoba Craft Council for organizing and hosting this discussion panel. It is my pleasure to join these three artists in conversation today. Our plan, as Katrina outlined for the panel, is to first introduce our viewers to the work of each of the three artists via a brief overview of their work, and then to delve into a few questions that consider practice, inspiration, and materiality. Katrina will be rejoining us after the discussion to moderate the question and answer session to end the panel. So this panel, it's been wonderful. It's reconnected me with two artists who I've admired for many years and with whose work I'm well acquainted, and that would be Warren Carther and Ione Thorkelsson. And it's introduced me to the intriguing work of Carissa Baktay, who I wasn't familiar with before. And her work is currently being featured at the gallery at the Manitoba Craft Council. So while the rest of us are joining you here today from Manitoba, Carissa is joining us, I believe, from Iceland. So welcome, Carissa. So I'm going to start by asking Carissa to give that overview of her work. And I'd like to introduce you to Carissa Baktay, a multimedia sculptor who shares her time between Iceland and Alberta. As an experienced glassmaker, she has earned degrees from Alberta University of Art and Universidade Nova de Lisboa. I knew I was not going to get the pronunciation right, so there you go, but in Lisbon. Using experimental technologies and mediums combined with time-honored glassmaking methods, she has been invited to work in studios in Bulgaria, Norway, Finland, and Portugal. Recently, her work has been recognized with multiple grants from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Icelandic Artists Association, the Icelandic Design Fund, and the Alberta Foundation for the Arts. Her process-based practice is deeply connected to material and memory and uses glassmaking as part of her deconstruction construction process. By collecting, repurposing, and transforming materials, she transforms their presence in space and presents a new poetic material understanding that shares the borders between art, craft, and design. So welcome, Carissa, and I'll turn it over to you so you can share a bit of an overview of your practice.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helen, for the great introduction. Hi, I'm Carissa. Thanks also everybody for joining for wherever in the world you are. I wanted to start by showing the work that I'm presenting at the Manitoba Craft Council. as well as another body of work that I've been working on for the last number of years. So the work I'm showing in Manitoba is blown glass mixed with Icelandic horsehair. It consists of around 15 sculptures that are freestanding as well as wall hung. And so these are combining the threads of the horsehair mixed with blown glass that I've manipulated in a vessel form. So a lot of these forms are maybe comical or definitely very personal, and sort of are using glass in a more traditional sense as a vessel. This is one of the more early pieces that I've done on the left here, Little Lies, which is about 5.5 feet tall. And it's made out of, I would say, maybe 3 or 4 horse tails that have all been sewn together and combined and then strung through the glass to create this sort of present but absent body. A lot of the forms that I create are sort of inspired by verbs, or maybe the opposite way around, curving or hanging, tipping, things like that. I really like the association between title and object as a sort of sneak peek, I guess, into the more personal aspect of my work that I don't think is extremely important for the viewer to understand, but certainly as a maker, very important for me. And these works are actually just horsehair on canvas without any glass. And I'll speak a little later about my evolution with horsehair, but I started using it as a material proxy for glass threads when I wasn't able to work in glass. And this is the glass thread work, which is my other body of work I have on exhibition right now. It's called Soft Machine, and it's at the Glasmuseet Ebeltoft in Ebeltoft, Denmark. This is a body of work that started in 2016, and it's glass threads that I combine and manipulate in various ways, either by making machines for them or wrapping them around existing things. I also use like hard industry. I've been invited to glass production facilities to be able to use their equipment. And these take all sorts of forms, just like former. Some of the components also involve blown glass as well, such as this one. So blown glass and glass threads that I've manipulated through various processes. I've fused them and then I kiln form them. Sometimes there's an interior object that I burn out to create the shape. This is actually from the exhibition Soft Machine at Glasmuseet Ebeltoft currently. And these take on various sizes, ranging from, handheld to, rather large, maybe a meter squared. So I think the most interesting piece for me right now is this one, which is actually using flat glass, architectural glass that's been laminated and constructed using a 3D process that I use for all of this glass thread work. But it's usually on the interior and then it gets lost or burned out in the process and I'm left with the threads. This piece is really interesting to me and it's starting this evolution of work where I'm using these interior forms that were first dictating the shape of the threads, and now I'm sort of making them out of glass and having them as the permanent object. The other interesting thing about this exhibition is that I have a number of glass types. This is actually lead crystal and post-studio glass. Another sculpture that we had just seen previously was recycled factory glass. So within this glass exhibition and using glass materiality, there's many different types of glass that I've been allowed to use and had the pleasure of playing with. And of course, there is some crossover between my two bodies of work. And I think they speak to each other a lot, such as these two pieces, one in glass and then one in horsehair. And then this also comes into my more design body of work where I manipulate the glass threads and use them as hot blow molds to create lamps or lighting fixtures. And this sort of aesthetic was originally the thing that drew me to using the glass threads, where I started to try to manipulate them in a form that looked like Icelandic traditional wool. And that sort of started the whole process of really me testing the boundaries of how far I could push the material of glass in this thread form. And then I thought I would just include these photos of my recent blown work, because that is part of my practice as well, where I still blow glass as well, and exhibited at design fairs in Iceland and as well in Canada.
Thank you, Carissa.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Our next artist is Warren Carther. Warren Carther's innovative sculptural glasswork focuses primarily on devising socially engaged projects for the public sphere. His work is informed by various elements in nature and the built environment. These works reflect the social and cultural context in which they were placed. Carther studied at the California College of the Arts in Oakland, California, with renowned glass artist Marvin Lepofsky. His work methods utilize industrial tools to grind, cut, color, carve, and laminate glass. These techniques have allowed him to achieve unique form and significant strength and scale in sculptural glass. He has installed his work on 3 continents. Some of those projects are among the largest sculptural glass projects in the world. Among his projects are installations at 2 Canadian embassies, Tokyo and London, as well as 5 airports, including Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport. Having won multiple awards, he is featured in numerous books on international contemporary glass. He has spoken on his work in China, Australia, New Zealand, USA, and Canada. Welcome, Warren.
Hello. Okay, so we will begin. These are basically chronological. My body of work and some of my larger projects. This first piece is in the Canadian Embassy in Tokyo, and it involves an inspiration from ikebana, which is the Japanese art of flower arrangement, which is what the architect Raymond Moriyama had based the entire building on. So within my piece, there are various symbols that reflect ikebana. But one of the things about this particular project is its structure. There are 91 glass panels there, approximately 2 feet by 3 feet. And I supported them by creating steel tripods in the back so that the glass all floats. And Tokyo being in an earthquake zone, the glass can jiggle and move without falling apart. So it's a design that I created with the help of my engineers. And I'm very happy to have done that because it allowed me to create a piece without a lot of steel mullions in between each of the glass pieces, so it's just one piece. The second piece is located in Winnipeg, and it's called Prairie Boy's Dream. It's 40 feet tall, and it is inspired by the landscape in Manitoba, and I think the dreams that all people on the prairies have. So there is part of the piece is actually laminated and built up 3-dimensionally from the front. The glass is curved. Each glass panel is 2 feet high and about 10 feet long and supported by steel structural columns on each side. Behind the figure, you'll see that there is what is an aerial view of farmland. And I was particularly struck by the fact that when you see the farmland from the air, the furrows reflect light back differently, so the colors seem to change. Over the figure's head, you can see that there are 3 triangles. And those triangles are actually the same color as the background material, but they have a different orientation, so light hits them differently. I found that very fascinating. Hong Kong. This is my largest project, weighed 35 tons, took 3 containers on a ship and 5 plane loads to get it over there. 40 people, 4 months to install. They weren't all working at the same time for all of that, but a huge crew of people. So this is the building from the outside, and there's a orangey yellow in the center. That is the first piece of the trilogy. It consists of 3 sculptures. First one is Vestige, the second one is Sea of Time, and the third one is Approach of Time. And they relate to time in Hong Kong. You may have noticed from that building there's a bridge, and at the end of that bridge, when you approach the building, is the first piece titled Vestige. And it, as I mentioned, it deals with the past. And I am on scaffold. I don't know, to me it looks very small, so I don't know if you can see it, but I'm actually on top of the scaffolding, and on the upper right-hand side, it gives you an idea of the scale. And here it is. Again, there's 3 people, so you can see how large it is. This one was inspired by ancient Chinese bronzes and British Tudor houses and doors in particular. So it's kind of a marriage between the 2 founding cultures. Sea of Time is the largest piece. It's 100 feet long and 29 feet high, and has 17 structural columns. You can't actually see all of it in this piece. There's some of it that's kind of not viewable from this particular angle in the center of it. Sea of Time references the present moment and the sensation of being lost in a sea of time where the past and the future seem very far away on distant shores. The third piece, Approach of Time, and here there's 2 photos, but on the left it's seen by day, and on the right it's being seen at night. And you'll notice that there's some dichroic glass in there which shifts in color. So the X's on that are lit during the day, when they're reflecting back light, they become blue. This piece is meant to be very optimistic. It shows it represents office tower architecture by the grid that's in it, and the height and the shape. The X's are actually in the shape of a boat, which when the client is the Swire Group, and they're one of the 3 British companies that started Hong Kong over 150 years ago, and their first industry was shipping on clipper ships. So the ships were very important to me. So I've combined geometry and organic form, and the form behind it is meant to be representing the spirit of people rising up. And I hope that doesn't sound too hokey, but that's kind of what I wanted it to be. This piece is for a company that we've all been hearing a lot about lately, Astrazeneca. Their headquarters is in Wilmington, Delaware. And I did this piece, which again reflects some of the land in that area and the fact that it may not be on the ocean, but the ocean is nearby and fields. The area that is rectangular with a series of circles on it actually is kind of an abstraction of a pill pack, which I thought was sort of funny to juxtapose with the landscape. Another one of my larger projects, this one is in Alaska. It's at the Anchorage International Airport, or Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. This project, there's so much in it, but the landscape in Alaska is phenomenal. Its scale is kind of unbelievable, with its mountains, its icebergs, and oceans, and forests, rock outcrops, and so that inspired these shapes overall. And I wanted it to be a very experiential piece, so that the escalators actually go in between the various panels. So there are 9 towers of glass here, 27 feet tall. They cover an area of about 135 feet. I'm going to talk about it later in some of the questions, but there are some copper-colored triangles in fields of mostly blue and green that are representative of what are known as coppers that are created by the Aboriginals, the local tribes, and given to their chiefs as a symbol of their great wealth and power. And in this piece, I'm giving those 7 coppers to Alaska as a symbol of their great wealth of nature. And that's really sort of the main focus of this particular work. And I've been very excited about the fact that something like 0.0001% of Alaska has anything built by human beings on it. And I think that's a pretty remarkable balance. So I've called the piece Euphony to reflect that. There's another view of that piece showing a large circle, which is a bit of an anomaly in the piece, and it represents a hydrogram and part of the industrial component. And in many of my pieces, I work with dichotomies, and quite often it's human activity and nature. Another detail from that piece showing the structural column, which is made out of aircraft aluminum. And this is Winnipeg. Its piece is titled Aperture. It has been inspired by the architect, Caesar Pelli, who is not from Manitoba, as many of you would know. But he was really in love with the Manitoba horizon line. And he created that glass curtain wall to show the view of the tarmac and the horizon line. And I love that he wanted to do that. And I think when I was first faced with this commission, I thought, well, maybe I want to do a piece that takes the light from that curtain wall, and something like what I did in Hong Kong, where I actually wanted to obliterate the view behind it. In this case, I wanted to bring the view into the piece. So the form has 2 cantilevers, and those openings allow you to see the horizon line behind it. It essentially brings the horizon into the piece. The rest of the form reflects snow, rock strata, prairie fields, buffalo stones that are often stoically located on the prairie landscape. And I intentionally did a piece that was a unique perspective. Most people don't think of the flat prairies as being a vertical presence, but in this particular case, I really wanted to do that very, very strongly. Detail from it. This is in London, Canadian Embassy. It's titled Unstill Life with Falling Snow and Beaver. The title refers to 2 iconic Canadian images. One, of course, being snow, and beaver, which has a lot to do with how Canada came to be and its connection to the United Kingdom. So there are multiple glass cylinders on the piece, which when seen from the side are very clear and white, but are colored when seen from an angle. My recent piece at Chancellor Station in Winnipeg. This piece is inspired by the wheels of the Red River cart, and they have a moire pattern inside, and they are colored with dichroic so that the colors shift. So the pieces actually appear to move. And here in the studio, one of my assistants is holding the piece, and the video's not playing very smoothly, but it does show how the glass changes color. And the Métis have a symbol of an infinity symbol, which grows out of the center of the piece. So it's very much an homage to the innovation of the Red River cart created by the Métis people. This is the second part of that project, which is located on at the base of the bridge for a rapid transit system. Detail looking up from the bottom. These pieces are very colorful at night.
Thanks, Warren. Wonderful. So we're going to move to our third artist we're featuring today, who is Ione Thorkelsson. Ione Thorkelsson was virtually self-taught in the technically unforgiving medium of blown glass. Ione set up her first studio in 1973 and was heavily influenced by the ethos of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement of the 19th century. Consequently, her career almost perfectly coincides with the history of the Canadian studio glass movement and is a textbook local example of the great post-war craft revival movement in North America. However, by 1993, she had begun exploring the expressive possibilities of various casting techniques, and by 2005 had abandoned blown work altogether. In the process, what had begun as an early, uncomplicated discovery and ecstatic exploration of the materiality of blown glass unexpectedly became a very compelling and at times startling personal artistic vision, full of surprise and improbable eloquence. In this sense, she falls almost perfectly across the unstable fault line between art and craft, and a close study of her career suggests an interesting alternative to theory-driven art practice. Ione.
Okay. So I'm just having.
Ione will be showing them off of her own laptop, so we'll just give her a second to pull them up.
Well, give me a second. You're seeing my screen?
I'm not seeing anything yet.
Oh, okay.
I'm seeing just the panelists.
Okay. Here we go.
Yeah, it looks like it started. It says you're starting screen sharing now, Ione.
Yeah.
Just waiting for the first image. I'll let you know when it comes up.
Oh, you don't have it yet?
There we are. Yeah, we're good. You could start, I think.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to give you a quick survey of a long career that started with blowing glass. This was my first studio in a chicken coop. And I was just blowing at that time. I was melting window glass and adding a few things to it. And the equipment was really basic, which I had built the equipment. My second studio, this is actually my third studio, was built for me and originally built for blowing glass, but it's still my studio and I'm casting there now. The blown work involved mostly color in functional pieces. I got a lot into reflective color, reactive colors. I used the different layers of the gathers of the glass and got into a lot of small detail. Perfume bottles were the best way to play with the color. About sometime in the late 80s, I started trying to cast glass, and I invented lost chicken foot casting, and started combining blown pieces with cast pieces in the kiln. That was shown in 1993, first in Brandon at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba. And in 1998, at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, a show called The Unwilling Bestiary, still with blown parts in each piece and combined in the kiln with a larger repertoire of cast pieces. I was still blowing glass at this point, and you can see that this was called also a retrospective, and that little line in the back is the blown work. That was the retrospective. In 2004, at the Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery in Waterloo, this is fragments and two partial reconstructions, everything we know about the Tropocene. This work, arboreal fragments from that show, was shown at the National Gallery for the Governor General's Awards show in 2010. In 2006, this was, I'm getting mixed up. This was in Toronto, a show called Ossuary that was in two galleries, a commercial gallery, this one and Material Matters, and it was also in the Toronto Free Gallery. Later, it was shown at the Carther Gallery in Ottawa, and this is one of the pieces from that called Matrix. This is my only architectural commission. It's at the Winnipeg Airport and called Incoming. Between the major shows, I often do smaller individual pieces. This is one called Mundus Adaptat, and this is Biopunk. In 2015, this show was first at the Ottawa School of Art. It's a show called Cynthia's Closet. The pieces are blown and then put into a kiln to adjust the texture and functional parts of the piece. Each piece has an LED light that's connected into the main building power source. This one has bones. This piece actually has fiber optics and the shafts from the feathers of birds, which this one has a fiber optics and a flowered calyx. The show, when it's set up, has 32 spheres that hang, and you walk in amongst them. This is the show as it was set up in Winnipeg. It was a very dark space, and you almost disorienting as you walked into it, and then you could walk in amongst the pieces. This is what I'm currently working on. I'm working on putting light into cast glass pieces. So this piece has a rechargeable battery, so it can be moved around and just plugged into recharge occasionally. The electrical components are part of the glass piece itself. And I'm now working on trying to make a handful of light. And that's my whole career.
Whole career in 5 minutes. I was very stingy with the time I gave everyone. But wonderful. So we'll move on to some of our questions now that people can be more familiar with work that each of you produce. So I'm going to start with Carissa with my first question. First, acknowledging that all of you, of course, are working with glass. However, your practices, as we just saw, vastly differ. None of you, I think, could really be described in the traditional sense as a vessel maker, perhaps what is traditionally most associated with the glass medium. So, Carissa, in the work presently in Denmark, Soft Machine, you spin fragile glass threads, taming them into suspended forms and individual filaments that reflect and become animated and light. So I'm wondering if you can talk to us about what drew you to glass, why do you find it the most effective medium for your art, and what you wish to express?
So I started as a glass blower. I think ACAD at the time, it was called ACAD. They had glass blowing classes, and my dad turned me onto it after seeing a Dale Chihuly PBS special. And so I was like hooked. I was in it, equal parts excitement, frustration. It was like really exciting. And, I got really obsessed with technical aspects of it. And at the time, wanted to be a glass blower. And I really thought I was following like where the material was leading me. And then I moved to Portugal to do my master's degree, and that, went completely upside down. I was coming from a studio that we had access to all the time, and then moving to a different style of studio where I had maybe less access. I was really forced, fortunately, to think about the material differently and to start using it in, maybe less conventional ways than what I was used to. I wasn't in there making.
Oh.
I was trying to figure out kiln casting. Sorry, did I freeze?
Yeah, but you're back. You're good.
Yeah, okay. And so this was like it really came from an aha moment, like a eureka moment, where I saw somebody pulling these thin threads, and I wanted to know, how far I could push that. And so the materiality of my work at that time really was revolving around being very resourceful. And I also became really interested in expressing materiality unconventionally, but in a surprising way, both for myself, but as for viewers as well. I wanted to make things in glass that really highlighted, the broadness of the material and the things that we don't consider so much, the things that make it so special, its thinness, its fragility, its transparency, the way it casts light. But from a different perspective. So that's where this thread manipulation came about. And then that too became an addiction, and sort of this technical fetish almost, where how far could I pull them? What could I spin them around? Really, how far could I pull the material till it became unrecognizable as glass, or still recognizable as glass? Like, when did it become something else? And was I okay with that even? So
yeah, we were talking a bit about this yesterday, but I was struck by how impermanent it is too, because you spin it in such thin, fragile threads that they really have a limited life in terms of being able to travel it, tour it, show it. It's incredibly fragile. It sort of takes the fragility of glass to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for my sort of style of making and how I feel in the studio, I try to, as much as I can, be an eco-centric maker. So the idea of impermanence in glass became a really interesting one to me, because we do think of glass as a permanent material when we find Roman ruins, but also very impermanent when we think about it as, the IKEA glass that you break on the ground and then throw into the garbage, or the bus shelter that gets shattered and then maybe become something else or not. So for me, it was really, it's interesting to know that they have a finite lifespan, and that to be a part of the evolution of the piece. And as well, I think I make a lot of work. And I think also as a maker, it's like okay to make work that doesn't last forever.
Sure.
And so this for me is a really nice way to like make glass sketches, but each one can still have as much value or weight to my practice or me personally as a final piece.
Thank you. Thank you. Ione, you cast glass into unexpected conceptual forms that suggest unknown eras and epochs, or genetic manipulation gone awry. So for you too, what drew you to glass, and why do you find it the most effective medium for your art and what you wish to express? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay. It was putting that pipe into hot glass was the first attraction, and it's just glass. The material itself that attracted me initially, and I've stayed with it as well. As I got into casting, it's the technical difficulty of working with glass. It's really complex, and it's your thinking process as you're working with the glass in great detail, and you end up, I think, thinking with your hands rather than or both. The because now I'm not blowing it anymore, and I don't have that hot molten glass which was so attractive. It's still the heat moving the glass within the hollow mold that I work with, and I don't work with it very much cold. I prefer hot. Even
I was thinking when you were saying about the technical aspect of glass, because I always see an alliance with what you're creating with science. You know, the study, like I said, either genetic manipulation or of past epochs and stuff. So I find it interesting that the technical aspects of glass really interest you as well.
Yeah, I to the point where I used to batch glass. So I was mixing my own batch from the sand, and I like the scientific part of it. So and there's a lot to it to glass that way. And then when you get into molds, there's all kinds of material explorations too that are pretty complicated and brush on science, at least.
Awesome. Thank you, Ione. And Warren, I'm going to ask you the same question about what draws you to glass and why you find it the perfect medium for what you wish to express, because you're obviously drawn to monumental installations, which create these opportunities for beauty and reflection in public spaces. I don't think glass is usually thought of the building block for massive walls. So what draws you to glass? Why is it your medium?
Okay, well, there was a moment, right, back when I was a student in fine arts at the University of Manitoba, where I was walking through the newly built Winnipeg Art Gallery, and they had the boardroom roped off, but the doors are open and you could look inside. And over the board table was a massive lamp designed by the architect Gus DeRosa, of spheres of glass with lights inside and like clusters of grapes. And when I saw that lamp, I just immediately flashed on the fact that why aren't artists using glass to do sculpture? It seemed very sculptural. At that time, I had never heard of Dale Chihuly or Harvey Littleton or my later teacher, Marvin Lepofsky. And I thought, well, I'm going to apprentice myself to a glass factory in Europe, and then I'll become the world's first contemporary glass artist. I had no idea that others. So then I started talking to my professors, and one of them told me about Dale Chihuly, Rhode Island, and Pilchuck. I ended up going to a small craft school in upstate New York for a summer, and then going to California to study with Marvin Lepofsky and blowing glass. And that was, I did that for a few years there, and I loved the process. Blowing glass, just the smell of the cherry wood blocks, the smoke, the heat, the color, the choreography, the whole thing was very seductive, and I loved it. But I couldn't do what I wanted to do, which was to build those massive walls of glass. And after I graduated, I went to a concert with Marvin Lepofsky, and at the end of the concert, on our way home, I said, you know, Marvin, I really want to build giant walls of glass, and I don't know how I'm going to do it. I have no idea, but I know I can't do it by blowing. That's what I want to do. And he said something like, Warren, I think you have the best head in the glass department. If anybody can do it, you can do it, figure it out, go for it. So that's kind of what I based my career on. It took me like 20 years to finally create what I had envisioned on that particular day, which probably happened in Hong Kong when I did that piece that was so massive. But I also discovered that if I worked very, very thick, I had the structural strength in the glass, and that would allow me to build with glass and to create those giant forms rather than other stained glass techniques, which you couldn't do that with.
No. Well, thank you all for that sort of peek into what draws you to the material. Now I'm going to take us to talking about your inspirations. So in all of your work, and I think Carissa, you mentioned it in your bio, this idea of poetry and the connection between the work that you do and literature or poeticness. And I think I can see all that aspect in all of your work, sort of an abstraction of narrative, if you like, or an expression that doesn't conform necessarily. So I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about where you find inspiration for your work. Do you start with a question, a problem to solve, if you're thinking more in technical aspects, perhaps like Ione or Warren have talked about? Or are you responding to contemporary events, issues? Is there, if you could maybe give our audience a bit of idea what spurs new bodies of work for you. So I'm going to switch up the order of responses this time and start with Ione. Oops, you're on mute again, Ione.
Got it. Okay. Okay.
All good.
So when I'm starting, I don't start with a preset idea. No. I am usually following the material. Certainly blowing glass, that was the case. And when I started casting, it was a case of looking for objects to cast. And they came from the environment I live in, which is a wooded escarpment in the middle of farmland. And there's lots of things like chicken feet and bones and whatnot here. So it was a case of starting to cast something that was castable and getting a glass foot or a glass bone. Mm. And as I worked with them and they came together, I really like the expression thinking with your hands, because it was building the pieces. And none of the major shows I did were, except for Cynthia's Closet, the decision wasn't made ahead of time what it was I was doing. The naming of the pieces, I was convinced after a while that I really had to name the pieces. And then they began to come together into bodies of work that were named and almost given a narrative, like the show in Waterloo, which came together partly out of desperation and a large space that I had to fill. So I went into other materials to fill that space. But they all come together before I name them, before the concept, except, as I say, for Cynthia's Closet, which was a moment where, again, it was my surroundings, because it was CBC radio, which is on in the studio all the time. And it was a report that life had been, man had produced life, basically. And a little exaggerated in the radio coverage, perhaps, but it was something that struck me, because I'd looked at those kind of things. I'd been reading about like Elaine Dewar's book, the Second Tree, and talking about the entrepreneurial aspects of studies in technology, basically. And that show. So I knew exactly what that show was going to be about. And even then, when I tried to work very directly with that idea, it took me ages to get over working like that and get to a point where I was working beside the ideas almost, so that I wasn't working directly with those in mind, but they were in the background and the material was dictating what I was doing again.
Yeah. So your work, I'm going to flip it over to Warren right now, but I'm intrigued because your work, with the exception of Cynthia, seems a bit more iterative, where it comes out of the process you're working in and it develops as you work. And I'm thinking, Warren, yours are largely, it seems, often commissioned. So you're obviously giving a package in advance with a much more thought out plan. So what sort of spurs the new body of work for you? Where do your ideas come from?
Well, I think that, when a lot of my work is public art, and I have been very fortunate in my career to have worked in a lot of different places in a lot of different cultures. And I really love to research and learn about those places and to try to reflect it in my work. You know, the land is often in there. Landscape often an inspiration on it, and I feel it's really important that people actually have a new perspective on where it is they are. I want them to feel that place, so that when they enter a space, I want to take them out of where they are and bring it into a bit of a realm of imagination, and to feel that space in a different way, and to not work with cliches. Like if I did a piece in Florida, I'm not going to do palm trees. You know, I'm not going to.
Yeah.
I'm not going to make things obvious. I'm going to make people work a little bit to find out what it is that I'm getting at, and to look at their own place and to look at their own history. You know, and a lot of it, I want to go back to the roots of that place very often, the cultures that were there initially, and those that followed them, and how that place evolved. And I also have a real love of architecture and architects. That's been I have as many friends that are architects as I do artists.
Right,
and,
of course, yeah.
And that's a huge inspiration, and I want the work to respond to the architecture. I want it to feel appropriate, and to respect that environment. And I guess if I were to compare Hong Kong and that Sea of Time piece, where I wanted to stop your vision so you couldn't see through the glass wall, and where in Winnipeg at the airport, I wanted to bring it in.
Yeah.
So those are the things that kind of push my work.
Interesting. And then Carissa, your work is very different from the other two. And so it's obviously, I mean, my next question has to do with the natural world, which ties all of your work as well together, but yours very much is rooted there too. So what is it that intrigues you? Like, what is it that spurs how you didn't cover in your slideshow? I know you have other bodies of work too that are vastly different from the two that you showed with threads. So what spurs you?
All of my work is really autobiographical, unimportantly so. I think a lot of it comes from dreams or memories or certain feelings and things that maybe I'm pondering on in some type of meditative process, which could be the process of making the work itself, and often is. So a lot of my work does have to do with this meditative connection to my own body and how bodies move, but also within a certain location. And so my bodies of work seem to change, and the materials I use and how I use them change depending on what I have access to at the time. I sort of try to kind of follow where things lead me. But I think like a lot of it, and especially with the thread work and the hair work, and often in my other works where I'm using like wax or porcelain or plaster castings, it does have a connection to the body and how bodies move. And so slumping, folding, swaying, and that I think, you know, falls into, like everyone was saying previously, the hot shop and like moving with glass. It's really not such a stationary material. And so that becomes part of it. And so, you know, within all these practices, I really do spend a lot of time with the process, like with the hair pieces and the thread pieces. These are the same movements that I do thousands and thousands of times, where I'm gluing individual strands of hair together, or I'm getting 1,000 gathers from the furnace a day to make, you know, the start of one of the thread objects. And sort of, I think I have an idea of, you know, the form it's going to take based on maybe the memory or the dream I had or the idea, but I definitely let that sort of marinate while I'm in the process and kind of follow where it leads me.
We had an interesting little chat yesterday, and I was intrigued by sometimes too, you were also somewhat limited, but it sort of spurred a different type of work by the situation you were in and the sort of workshop you had to work in. So kind of going back to Alone in the Chicken Coop too, or Warren trying to go large and you know, all that impact by the situation of what you're building as well and where you're building it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if you have an idea or that like lust for making, you find a way. It doesn't really matter the material or the process. You're able to express it.
Yeah. So my final question I have for the panel before we open it up to question and answers was something all three of you have already voiced at some part of what we've discussed today, or impact, and that is the impact of the natural world on your work. You can see it in many of your pieces. So I'm going to start with Warren for this question. And Warren, your immense walls of glass carry abstract symbols and varied surface textures. They're not flat, they're layered and built up, which are reminiscent of map topography to me, or even, and you mentioned this actually in your introduction, flying thousands of feet above and looking down at the landscapes below. So, and then you have your other work, such as Aperture at the Winnipeg Airport, which appears almost as if a rock or a canyon formation, yet at the same time positions and directs the viewer to appreciate a specific vista through the positioning of the piece. So that landscape beyond the landscape created through your work. So what is it that drives you to reflect on place or geography in your work?
Well, I touched on that as you mentioned a little bit about wanting it to represent the place where the pieces are, because they're permanent. They're not an exhibition that moves around.
Yeah.
But I like for my work to live in the real world, to be in a place where people encounter, sometimes by chance and sometimes on purpose. But it reflects where they are, and I think that the topographical map has been in my work from the very beginning. And at first it was very much in my subconscious, and then later on it became very much a real part of it. One of the moments where I kind of understood the concept of seen from the air and from the land was, I was doing a piece in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, at their Legislative Assembly building in the Central Council chamber, 160 feet around the Central Council. And in looking for inspiration for that piece, I walked across a frozen Great Slave Lake with an Inuit stone carver. And we looked at the snow beneath our feet. And I thought the textures in that snow and the ice were reminiscent of what I saw flying into Yellowknife in the plane, and seeing the snow from thousands of feet in the air was very similar to seeing the textures that were below my feet. So that I incorporated into that piece in Yellowknife, and I did again in Anchorage, the similar sort of landscape and ideas were there. But I often like to change things up. I want to change your perspective. So all of my pieces have multiple perspectives. They can be seen from the normal perspective, from up above, from down below, small, large, comes from a lot of different ways. And so with Winnipeg Airport, I switched it all around again to reflect the landscape in a completely different way, even though it's representing the same things. There's snow and there's ice and landscape. But
I'm thinking when you're talking of Prairie Boy, actually, which was one of the first pieces I saw of yours in Winnipeg. And I was a newly transplanted Winnipegger from BC, and I was struck by the scale of the sky in the prairies, which is extremely different from the scale of the sky on the coastal parts of Canada. And Prairie Boy, like the picture you showed, you can see the form of the boy and you see that vast blueness or the sky around, but you can also then flip it and think of it about looking down. So when you're talking about the various different perspectives in your work, how you can see them from various orientations and get an appreciation both from above or from the side, I immediately thought of that piece very much.
Yeah, it's definitely there.
Yeah. Carissa, your latest work on display currently through the Manitoba Craft Council here in Winnipeg combines the unlikely pairing of hair from horsetails and glass. Other bodies of your work seemingly reflect the practical limitations, as I mentioned before, of location, access to materials and workshops. Can you speak how these considerations compelled you to combine the soft, organic, pliable horsehair with cool, hard, structured glass, and why you think it works? And feel free to also address any of your other works as well. You don't have to stick with just the horsehair, but I am intrigued by it, having seen it just recently here in Manitoba.
Yeah, so I started making that when I started sort of spending more studio time here in Iceland. And at the time, the only glass blowing studio here was closed down. I wasn't able to access glass blowing or even the thread making. When I would go on residencies to make glass with the threads, because they have such a finite lifespan, I really wasn't able to, or didn't feel the need to transport them. So I started making smaller glass objects, more vessel forms that I could bring back with me and then play with. And at first I was using a lot of local grasses, seagrasses and things like that until I discovered that I could get access to horsetails, which is part of the commercial
a little bit
process here. So it's just I guess an everyday meat. Oh, am I back?
Back now. So you kind of froze. You introduced the horsetails and then it kind of tapered off.
Yeah, so I can get them at the slaughterhouse. It's part of the commercial meat factory here, which was really interesting and very lovely for me because I was feeling a lot of feelings of displacement. I was thinking a lot about home. I had a lot of nostalgia and thinking back to my childhood. So when I discovered I was able to get horses' tails, it was, I think, very eye-opening within my practice. I get them from the slaughterhouse and I clean them really well, usually in the sea and then in the river. And then I cut them off the tails and I wash them with shampoo and straighten them. And it's this really loving process that allows me like a lot of meditative time with the material. So then I started thinking about glass again, more like a vessel, like I traditionally would use it, and how I started sort of my glass exploration. So those were things that I could make, you know, when I went to Norway, and then I could bring them back to Iceland and over time play with them. And really just this idea of the glass as a vessel that's sort of holding something, but not the same way we consider it normally. It's not something for consumption. They're more open-ended vessels. But again, this transparent thing that without something in it doesn't particularly have a form, paired with hair, which in itself could be quite formless. And so them acting together to, I guess, create the sculpture, the structure of themselves, was something that I found really interesting. And then as I said, I spent all this time with it and a lot of thinking and a lot of memories. And I think a lot of the work that I do in horsehair does have a lot of relationship to like family and as well childhood memories.
Yeah, it's interesting too because of the way that the horsehair falls in a number of your pieces is sort of incorporating directly the natural aspect of it. It's impossible to completely tame it 100%. You know, especially a 5-foot piece and that, so you have that aspect.
And I tried to make, you know, I thought I really wanted to tame it. And I'm interested in making these things that nobody believes is horsehair because it can't be real hair. It must be nylon. It's too long. So that's something that interests me. And I cut some of the pieces, but almost it removes the hairiness a little bit. And so sometimes I like that play of a very, a material with a lot of meaning becoming like a plastic or a nylon thread. And then other times I think it's interesting to keep that a little bit of like tension. I think viewers have mixed feelings about the material. And, you know, growing up in Alberta and spending most of my life in Alberta, you know, horses and ranching was all over me. And as a little girl, everybody wanted a pony. But other than that, I really didn't have a relationship to horses. So I guess this is my little pony experience in my mid-30s.
And Ione, your work from the early 2000s or so were almost creative from casting animal bones and reassembling them. reimagining the disparate parts into mystical creatures from past eras. A more recent work incorporated rather eerie, dramatically lit glass orbs filled with modified organic matter. Often I found in a very startling, sometimes almost violent manner with the way that they were pinned as though they were almost specimens within those orbs. So can you speak to what it is about science? We touched upon this a little bit already, science and technology that compels you to draw our attention to its impact on the natural world. In some ways, I think your work has these messages of human meddling, if you like, in the natural world.
Yes, good word. I want to comment on your use of the word violent.
Yeah, no, please do. And if you disagree,
yes, it's fascinating always to see how somebody else sees your work and to see a response that I hadn't anticipated.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and very interesting to watch that. And the science and technology, I don't inquire very much as to why usually. I think it's because partly it's the complexity of the questions that our science is asking at the moment, and science is facing, and that the world beyond scientists should be looking at the complexity of these questions too. And there's no black and white direct answers to most of the questions that are being asked with the bio fiddling that people are doing. Mm-hmm. So it's important, I think, for people from other walks of life besides science to be looking at these things.
And your pieces where you started casting too, and you related them in your writings about those works to, imagined eras of previous existence, perhaps, for some of these beings that you created. And I in my imagination could imagine, because you live in a rather rural area on the escarpment, of these kind of strange creatures that might have inhabited out there. Like, is where you live part of that inspiration for you for some of this work?
We actually live on what was the shore of Lake Agassiz. So when you go to Morden, which is just south of us, and they have a museum with the creatures that swam in Lake Agassiz, these huge bone structures. So that was part of the influence for those pieces too, in that way of interpreting them. But it's that I let them grow, and as they grow, those things come into them, I think. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Surrounding what's around.
Well, I'm just looking at the time, and Katrina, we're at 3:09. Did you want one more question, or would you like us to go to Q&A?
I'm fine with whichever. Would you guys like to start the Q&A or do one more question?
Looking to my artists.
Do one more. This is so great to hear this discussion.
One more question.
Okay, one more. Okay, so this one is actually for our, I was thinking we probably have members of our glass community listening today. So given that each of you work with glass in non-traditional ways, I was wondering if you could share just one tip or lesson learned with the glass community listening to this panel that has been a breakthrough or a eureka type moment for you in your personal exploration of glass as a medium. So I think I'll start off with Warren.
Okay, well, for me, it was the thing that changed my work totally was discovering how working with thick glass allowed you to build, and I mentioned that earlier. But previous to this moment in my first studio here in Winnipeg, I had experimented a bit with stained glass and was really discouraged at how it could flop over and that I couldn't do what I wanted to do with it. And there are certain aspects of it that I love, but what I really wanted to do, I couldn't do. And then I came to the realization that if I worked with 3/4 or inch or 19 millimeter glass, it was structurally strong enough for me to carve into it, and it could still have that strength. And I could fire colors into it, or I could carve it with sandblasting, I could laminate onto it and build it up even further. So I used all of those processes, but there was just now one moment when I realized I don't have to follow the traditional ways of doing it. I didn't know anybody who was doing any of the things that I wanted to do at that time. I mean, this was 1981, I think, 82 maybe. And I didn't know anybody who was working with thick architectural glass at that time. I think there are a few people now, but there wasn't at that time. And so that was my one. I've had several, but that's the one I'll talk about.
Considering the size and scale of some of your pieces, I think you mentioned in the introduction, one of them was about 40 feet tall. I'm not sure, but I think that's what I said. I'm still surprised that something that's still less than an inch in width is strong, has the tensile strength to go to those heights.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's on edge, right? So it's like two feet, and glass is as strong as granite when it's thick. It's just that glass, when it's thin, is very brittle, and window panes break easily. Glasses, as were mentioned by Carissa before, break quite easily. But when it's massive and thick, you can hit it with a hammer. You know, it just doesn't. It's hard to break, and I found it really difficult to convince people of that and to actually do outdoor work. And I'm thrilled now that I've done a few pieces, and most recently the one for the rapid transit in Winnipeg has that people will trust it to be outdoors. They're afraid of vandals or whatever, but it's the same as stone. I mean, if you hit a piece of marble or granite with a hammer, it's going to break. And glass, when it's as thick as that, will be it'll chip as well, but that's what it would take to break it.
Thank you. Ione, what was your eureka moment?
I think, well, as Warren said, that there's, because you're exploring all the time, there's several, but I think it was when I finally figured out how to make cast chicken feet, and when I attached them to a blown piece. And it wasn't like an instant sort of eureka moment. It was, well, that's pretty interesting. And I actually glued feet onto a blown bowl, and it sat on in the windowsill in the shop for weeks. And I was trying to get that look at it from some other point of view that I think probably most people do when they're making things. So that you can walk in on it and see if it really is working the way I thought it might be.
So your eureka moment went over several weeks.
Yes, right.
And Carissa, what was yours that you'd like to share?
It was seeing threads pulled. I thought, good glass had to involve a lot of technique, at the time, and just being able to see what you could make or do or manipulate with one small gather on a hot pipe, and that be it, and like how far you could extend the materiality. That was the moment for me, sort of questioning everything that I thought I had been taught, or really not been taught, but what I had learned for myself about the material.
Well, I think that was my final question. So I think I'll turn it over to Katrina now, who's going to moderate the Q&A.
Hi, folks. If you have any questions there's already several there, but if you have any more questions for the panelists, feel free to enter them into the chat. You will need to sign into your YouTube account to do that. We have lots of questions and comments from our panelists. If it's a group question, just raise your hand if you want to answer it, and I'll take note, and then I'll ask you all in order so we don't all start cutting in on each other. Some of them are specific though. Here's a comment from Sandy R. I love how the glass threads give the illusion that they are in motion and as able to move as the horsehair tails or threads. So that was for Carissa. Sandy R wanted to know, Warren, where is the sea bridge?
Oh, Warren, you're on mute.
Warren, you're still muted. Warren seems to have a little tech thing going on, so we'll come back to that one, Warren. We'll give you a second to figure that out. This is for anyone. So for folks with national and international experience, do you notice fundamental differences in appreciation or understanding of glass art in an audience today versus when you first started?
I can take that one while we're waiting for. I don't think that there's a major difference in the way it was received at the beginning. There was certainly more when I started. There was an excitement with the just the studio glass movement. So there was excitement about that. Galleries, etc., were pretty enthusiastic about having it. And the first show I had was in the International Women's Year, something like that. Anyway, it was a year of women, and so it was a big deal to have glass and be in the feminist sort of vein that was at the moment. Perhaps there's a little less excitement about glass now.
Anybody else like to talk about their national or international experience and how it's changed over time? The appreciation's changed over time.
Am I still muted or am I on there?
You are good to go, Warren.
All right. I don't know what happened. I was clicking and it wasn't showing up. Anyhow, yeah, I think working internationally has been kind of exciting for me. It's allowed me to grow my work in such a way that I never would have expected before. To deal with different cultures in particular has allowed me to really just grow my art, to grow my thoughts, to expand everything that I've been working on, and to meet phenomenal people and be in phenomenal places. I mean, a couple of years ago, my God, I got to talk to the Queen about my piece. That was exciting. She liked it, but she's got to say that, right? Anyhow, that's
Carissa, would you like to comment? Yeah, I mean, I can't say over like a certain time frame because I think I'm still pretty green, but I've been able to work, in Central Europe and Northern Europe and Scandinavia and North America. And I think, one thing is with glass blowing, I think that's where you're more or less able to see the trends, I think, of what's sort of popular at the time. And in North America, I think we're really blessed with the studios and the access that we have. There's a ton of just incredible artists. And one thing I'd say is like pipe making now, which, 10 years ago was an obsolete form of art or something that was maybe less mainstream, not obsolete, and is now just absolutely incredible and receiving a lot of recognition. So I think, within Europe, there's also these other niches, there's a lot of glass cutters or glass casters, and sort of it depends. But of course, because we get to travel a lot more, there is this dissemination and sharing of ideas that's really happening a lot as well.
Thank you, everyone, for your awesome answers to that. Warren, we can go back to where that bridge is, the Sea Bridge.
Sure. I don't know whether the person is from Winnipeg or not, but if you're not from Winnipeg, it's in Winnipeg. If you are in Winnipeg, then it's on the Rapid Transit Bridge just west of Pembina Highway on Bishop Grandin. So,
Warren, at which point in the design or creation process do you need to engage the engineers? Do you need specialized crews to build your monumental works?
I definitely need specialized crews to work with it. Yeah, different people doing different things. You know, at one point, engineers? Well, it's pretty much at the beginning, because if it's not going to work, if it's not going to stand, the whole piece fails. So I have to bring engineers in. Typically, I will design what I have in mind, and then I will review it with an engineer, and the engineer will tweak it and do the calculations, and if it needs. Usually there's only very small modifications that have to be made, which makes me very happy because I don't think any artist wants to have their piece changed. I had a very frustrating experience on one piece, and I won't identify it, but an engineer, and this was my first large project, and it was made out of panels. They wanted me to surround it with 5 inches of steel mullions, and for me, that kind of took away from the piece. I wanted the glass to be forward. For that particular piece, I didn't want the steel to be dominant. And but being so young and so inexperienced, I thought engineers were gods, and I couldn't I couldn't dispute what they had to say, and so we went with that. And then later, when I was meeting with architects for the Tokyo project, we were discussing the fact that this was like just the same thing, only much larger. And I said, well, you know, I have some other ideas, you know, about holding the glass together to make it structurally work. And so I basically hired an engineer to work with me, rather than somebody who was kind of working against me. So that turned out to be a very positive experience, and ever since then, my experience with engineers has been fabulous. I've worked with people that have been amazing and really understand what I'm trying to do and work with me. And so one of my favorite engineers unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and I really miss him because he was so much fun to work with. But nevertheless, everybody since then has been really good as well.
Thank you so much, Warren. I'm just going to read some compliment comments, everyone's favorite. Jacqueline Young says, absolutely stunning work all. And Sandy R says, many moons ago, I saw Ione's birch trees with the cast lit sections at the WAG. My reaction to the piece, it felt spiritual to me. It felt like I was transported to some mythical place. A question I personally have for everyone is, how did you get involved in glass initially? Because I know glass isn't the most common material to work with. Like, how did that come together for you when you were younger?
So polite. It was at ACAD. I was in painting, and then I started building a lot of canvases for myself, and bigger canvases, and just realized that I liked building canvases more than painting on them. Growing up, my father was a mechanic, so I was always sort of around equipment and tools and machinery. And then it was him that had recommended that I try taking a glass blowing class when I first got hooked on it. So thank you, ACAD, AUA, thank you.
Okay, well, I've already kind of answered that question, but I can say that after I saw that lamp and glass and had the understanding of what could be done with glass, when I started to learn, the more I learned about it, the more I loved it, and the more I worked with it the more I found I could do. And work that the fact that glass had all these qualities that no other material has. The fact that you could blow it, and you can't blow steel, you can blow glass because it's a super cool liquid and because it doesn't have a melting point. And all those fascinating aspects of it, the colors, the dichroic glass, the way it changes, you can have, it reflects one color and transmits another. Just so many aspects to glass that no other material has. There's nothing else on earth that can do what glass does. And that has always excited me. It's been exciting me now for, 35 years or something like that. I've lost track, and it always will. It's a phenomenal material. And once you've discovered glass and what you can do with it, there's just no going back. I don't know very many people that used to work in glass but then stopped. Oh, actually, I just thought of somebody. Okay, forget that. Some people, I guess, move on, but very few.
Thank you, Warren. Ione, do you have any comments on that?
I kept talking about, I actually saw a presentation by someone who did lamp working in the center space of the architecture building at the University of Manitoba. And I was talking about it too much to all my friends. And then somebody told me they'd seen a program on Sheridan College. And it was like a CBC program on the glass blowing course at Sheridan College. And so I just got there as fast as I could. And my addiction is the same as Warren describes. It's an addictive material.
Can I just add something here, Katrina?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a personal story for me. I came to the Winnipeg Art Gallery in 1998 as an intern, and I started there on a 3-month position and just carried slowly through my career at the WAG over 16 years. And when I came, and for the first while, I was doing a lot of different materials and I sort of pinch hitting in the curatorial department wherever it was needed. So it could be contemporary, it could be Canadian art, it could be painting, sculpture, decorative arts, whatever was needed. And I with my background and my studies, I sort of made a niche for myself in the decorative arts and the craft field, but I came in more heavily on the historical side. And one of the first shows at the WAG when I was there was The Unwilling Bestiary by Ione Thorkelsson. And I remember standing in that gallery. It was darkly lit, these strong lighting on these creatures that just glowed in that light. And they were high pillars, so you had to sort of look up at them. And I remember just, for me, not as an art, like a craft practicer, but as I like to think of it as a craft appreciator, that's what made me passionate on the moment about doing contemporary craft. And that's where I tried to center most of my work whenever I could, was on contemporary craft and working in textiles and metal and glass and ceramic and that. And it was because it was something that was unexpected for me. It took it to a different level than I had ever thought, considered glass to go in. And then I met Warren and his huge monumental pieces and onwards. And it was incredibly exciting to sort of stumble on that and just feel that passion for it. So just for all of you out there who are glass producers, not appreciators like me, thank you. Because it's been an incredible career out of working with people in craft. Those experiences stay with you a lifetime.
Thank you, Helen. Jenny, would you like to comment on your connections to glass?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to hear you speak about that, Helen, as well. I think, so I come from actually a family where my father is a glazer. So glass has I was raised around glass. Glass paid for my braces. And it's interesting to come from sort of that blue collar background and end up in the art world. And working with Chris is actually the first artist I've worked with that has worked in glass. And it's been so interesting to hear about her processes and hear about some of the technical stuff that, like, I thought I was around glass. I thought I knew this stuff. And to learn a little bit more from that. And then in reflecting back on that, realizing, well, I have seen these incredible examples of glass art and craft, as Helen is saying, seeing Ione's work at the WAG, seeing Ione's work around Winnipeg and the art scene, and being so blown away by the chicken feet and realizing the possibilities of what glass could do. Seeing Prairie Boys Dream, you know, I was a student at the University of Winnipeg, and I would walk through the investors group building in the dead of winter to get out of the cold in order to get over to the mall, and passing that piece so often. And just realizing, like, oh yeah, that's glass, there it is again. So that material, I feel like it's been with me for a long time. And I think I've carried it with me as a curator, but to have this opportunity to finally work with a glass artist one-on-one, and to have that reflection that, oh yeah, I have been surrounded by incredible glass artists. And now to hear the three of you talk in conversation, propelled by Helen's great questions, is such a treat and a pleasure. I wanted to ask a question and pose to you all, and it's very broad, but again, sort of bringing that forward of knowing, like, well, I feel like I come to this, like, I know glass. I don't know glass at all, I realize now. For the three of you, for audiences, for viewers that are kind of uninitiated in glass craft or glass art, or you know, well-meaning curators like myself, what do you want those viewers to see when they approach a work in glass? Is there like a cheat sheet, some insider knowledge? You know, in speaking with Carissa, there were things that would come up that would think, oh, I've never considered that about glass. But when you're in it and you're doing it, are there any ideas, any things, any topics around glass as a material, on the technicality, on the history, anything like that, that would help just the greenhorn viewer coming in to see your work or any glass work for the first time? And that's open to anyone.
That's a challenging question. You know, it's so broad and yet so specific at the same time. It's like, I think that maybe that thing that I'd like for people to see is that that glass is more than window panes, and it's more than something to hold liquids. It's a material that can be made into some of the most spectacular art that you'll ever see. And I want to surprise people, I think, with that notion of, wow, this is a material that I've been surrounded by my whole life, but I've never really looked at. So for people that have never really thought of glass as art, I would hope that would maybe tweak something in them. So perhaps for a few of them, they would have that eureka moment, and they would then become maybe a practicer, a maker, an artist, or maybe just an appreciator. But hopefully just to open eyes and make people think about a material in maybe a new way. So pass it on to anybody else.
Thank you, Warren. What a great answer. Ione?
I think that one of the important things about it is that it is beautiful. That even when the work you're looking at is approaching difficult subjects, that to let the beauty happen, let that come through. Don't worry about it. Accepting the beauty of it is an important part of the glass. And the work.
I mean, I think in that respect, you know, glass is so beautiful in itself. It's like hard not to be seduced by it in general. You know, its shininess, refractiveness, all of those sort of things. It's interesting that we're posing this question, and I think it's a good one for like a craft council, and a more or less, I guess we're coming here as craft makers in our own rights, but also perhaps we're all artists as well. And, you know, given the question that how to look at a craft material as a work of art, I would answer the same way you would go into looking at any works of art. I think, within any material boundaries or mediums in general, there's you're going to like a certain something and then not like a certain something. And of course, I think also that there's a space for well-made objects and not well-made objects within that as well. So hopefully one day, I think it is changing. Of course, I don't have a long career, but I think it is changing so that glass is slowly creeping into all these other sort of areas, design. Warren's working in architecture, and it's not just sitting in the craft realm, where we saw it with the onset of the studio glass movement. And even, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, now it's being more broadly used by all sorts of different makers and thinkers. And I think that's something really special that's happening with the material.
I agree, Carissa. I think craft is becoming more prevalent in art generally, and glass especially. I have a fun question. Has anyone ever blown lava before? Although I will say molten glass looks like lava to a non-glass blower.
We have a volcano right now. Sorry, Iceland has a volcano right now. And I did walk out there with my blowpipe thinking I was going to, oh, sorry. Did I cut out? Am I back? Okay. Yeah, so I went out there with my blowpipe thinking I was going to dip my tip into some lava, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. I could get like 4 meters away from it, and I had all my Kevlar gear on and everything, but the heat was just so incredible. And not only that, it was like this sense of hot, like anybody who's been in a hot shop knows hot. But this was like this weird heat I can't explain, other than the heat was telling me that I wasn't supposed to be there. Like the air quality changed. It was very like, I went into panic mode. I kind of like pushed my rod as far as I could, but I couldn't get close at all. And I suspect anyway, the material density is so incredible that I probably wouldn't be able to get the rod in. And of course the rod is cold, so it would just kind of hit up against the surface. But I felt like I would be a bad glass blower if I didn't at least we hiked like 7 kilometers with the blowpipe up the mountain, just in case.
I was not expecting anyone to have such a robust answer for that question. And thank you so much.
That sounded like a setup to me. Are you sure? You know? I don't have a lava story. No, I don't. Ione, do you have a lava story?
I have one more question, and it's for the artist. Do you feel particularly Canadian as an artist? So I'm going to assume that they're meaning, do you think that Canada or your sense of place here has a reflection in your artwork? You'll probably have to think for a second on that one. It's a gooder.
Yeah, I think it has absolutely affected my work, but I don't know how to put my finger on it, I don't know that it can always be described in words, but there's something about living in the North. There's something about the landscape. There's something about how the country has evolved that is kind of ingrained in you and comes out. But I don't know that I could actually define it and be specific about it, but I just recognize that it's there. And I certainly feel it when I travel. I notice that there are different ways of being, and different people from different places come at things from a different perspective. But again, to be specific, no, I can't.
Thank you, Warren. Would anybody else like to give their perspective on that question?
Yeah, I think the prairies definitely come into my work in the color palettes that I use. And maybe, I think perhaps part of the Canadian identity that we're so proud of is our connection to land and the landscape, which is definitely a reoccurring theme in my work. Not to say that it's uniquely Canadian, but at least with the prairies and that blue sky and wheat fields, that's definitely something that I call home.
I think my work has a very direct connection to the place I live, which happens to be Canada. So it's I don't know that I identify it as Canadian, as very local to where I live.
Okay, I think that's our last question. Thank you folks so much for such an interesting and really fabulous conversation. We have some comments about how interesting this was and all of the seeing all of your different types of work and how fabulous it was. So thank you so much for that great conversation. And Carissa Baktay's exhibition is currently installed at the Craft Council, but unfortunately we are locked down right now. So you can see her exhibition. There's a digital tour of it on our YouTube channel that you are watching right now. And also, restrictions pending, we are hoping to have Carissa's show run for July and August, but keep an eye on our social media and newsletters to find out if that's the case, because we are adjusting as the community adjusts. So we hope to see you in person for that, Manitoba, but we're waiting and finding out. So thank you to Helen, Ione, Carissa, Jenny, and Warren for such a wonderful panel discussion. And I can't wait to see all the great work you guys keep putting out in the future.
Thanks, Katrina. And thanks, everyone. It was a great afternoon.
Indeed. Thank you all. It was just very enjoyable. Very enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you. And I highly recommend seeing Carissa's work in real life.
Yeah. Ione.
I'm dying to see it. Yeah, I haven't seen
Ione got a sneak peek.
Ione, you're killing me. I remember in my undergraduate year looking up to you and like researching your work when I started my casting class. So I appreciate it. Okay, thank you. I hope you guys can make it out to see my show. Thanks for everything. See you soon.